Salman Rushdie is perhaps one of the most well-known names in contemporary literature. He received international attention when the Ayatollah Khomeini called for his execution over the publication of his novel, Satanic Verses. Multi-million-dollar bounties were offered, and the book was banned in several countries, including his native India. In exile, he only became more prolific, completing essays, stories, and one of his most critically acclaimed novels, The Moor's Last Sigh. His latest novel is called The Ground Beneath Her Feet. It is his retelling of the myth of Orpheus, set in the contemporary world of rock and roll. I am pleased to have him on this program to talk about this and other things. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Where does the fatwa stand since, I mean, do you feel any more comfortable and safer?
Yeah, I mean, I do. You know, frankly, the truth is that I've been getting on with my life anyway. You know, I've been not waiting for the Iranians to come and give me permission.
Right.
But it's true, it was a very important
But even the foreign
step.
minister or Hatami, one of them said, what, that the fatwa is over as far as they're concerned?
As far as the government's concerned, it does seem to be over.
And then others radicals said, look, it could only have been taken back by the original Ayatollah,
well,
so therefore...
but it's never been a theological thing. It's always had to do with the political will to carry it out or not to carry it out, you know. And I mean, let me put it this way. For 10 years, I was told that the only real threat to my life came directly from the Iranian government, in particular its intelligence ministry and their agents, you know. And now I'm told that's not so. So that's a big thing. Now, however, it remains true that Iran is a splintered leadership, you know, and that there are kind of shadowy paramilitary groups around the edge of the regime who don't necessarily do what Khatami and the foreign minister Karazi say. And so there remains a risk of that sort. However, in my view, that's not comparable to the risk that was faced earlier, which had the entire apparatus of the state, you know, and its embassies abroad and all its resources, you know, involved in this. That's no longer the case.
And a couple of people were assassinated who were
long time ago,
involved in the publication of...
Yeah, and those were all professional hits. You know, those weren't random crazies. You know, those were all hits ascribable to the intelligence ministry.
Do you know, I mean, I assume you do, whether you had a near miss at all?
I didn't have a near miss, in that I don't, you know, they never got outside the house, so to speak, you know, but there were, I should say, half a dozen occasions over the course of these years, none very recently, I'm happy to say, when the British told me that in their view there was a person or a group, you know, that had entered the country with intent to carry out the fatwa, and that therefore there was a real attack underway, you know, and then at a later point I was, you know, given a kind of green light. And it's true that in these years probably 12, 15 Iranians were expelled from England for reasons connected to trying to carry out the fatwa.
Now, it's still, St. Valentine's Day is a part of this book.
Yeah, well, that's where it starts, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you know, it's a love story. It should start on Valentine's Day, I thought. But obviously it starts on that Valentine's Day.
Yeah, exactly. 1989, was it?
Yeah, and one reason for that is to just to sort of to fess up, you know, to say this is also a day on which there was an earthquake in my life, you know.
Yeah.
But it had a kind of quirky, sort of odd, more personal reason for me, which is I wanted to have the day to have a different meaning, you know. For 10 years, this date, February 14, 89, has had this sort of terrible meaning for me, you know, just the worst day in the world. I wanted it, I mean, now at least a little bit, I can think of it as a day on which my novel begins. You know, it's just stealing it back for art, I thought.
I have read that your next book may very well be a kind of memoir of that period.
Yeah, that's unfounded speculation is what that is, because actually I did think about that for a while. And I changed my mind quite soon, because I thought that if I were to do that now, it would probably mean my re-immersing myself in this very painful material that I've just spent 10 years kind of going through. Spend another 2 years with it, and then probably another 6 months to a year talking about it when it comes out, you know, and it's like giving myself another 3 years of it. And I thought I can't think of anything in the world I'd rather do less.
Well, then do you have somewhere else something that says, that says Orpheus, rock and roll?
Yes, I do, actually. I do. I have a couple of things, and I'm not quite sure which is going to insist, you know, and again, I try to look for things I haven't done, you know, so...
experiences you haven't explored?
No, just even kinds of writing I haven't done, you know, and I've been very interested for a very, very long time in the in the Florentine High Renaissance, in the time of Machiavelli and the Medicis and Botticelli and et cetera, Savonarola, you know, the burning of the books, etc. I mean, that's one thing that I'm just trying to think about whether that's time to do it now. And the other thing I've got is kind of, it couldn't be more different. So the opposite end of the spectrum is a kind of futuristic thriller, you know, sort of, I don't know, my attempt at Blade Runner. You know, so yeah. We'll see. It'll probably end up being something completely different to either of those.
Because this did not happen here, would you please explain to me, did you have a feud? You didn't have a feud in London, did you?
No,
okay,
no.
Great. Then somewhere I thought I'd read somewhere there was some feud that you engaged in.
No. I think all this is what happened is that there's another novel coming out by another writer of Indian origin, Vikram Seth.
Right.
And all the media decided to try and put us head to head. You know, yeah. Rushdie versus Seth. You know, etc.
I see.
I mean, actually, we have no feud at all. We get on perfectly well.
Okay. Speaking of India, though, you now have a visa to go back, but you have elected so far not to go back.
Yeah, that's right. But that's because they produced this visa just a couple of months ago, just as I became involved more or less full-time in working on the publication of this book.
So it's just a matter of time?
It's just, yeah, I just think I've got to get through this publication period, and then we'll see, yeah.
Then we'll see whether you go back?
We'll see when and how and, you know, et cetera, I'll set it up.
But you're anxious to do it?
Oh, well, you know, I haven't spent 10 years fighting for a visa in order to not go.
Oh, I know, but I mean, once you win that battle, you might have said, okay, now I'll take my time, or maybe I'll...
No, I want to just find the appropriate way, you know, and I want to... There is a problem. I've spent enough of my life being a political football, you know. I don't want to go and plunge into the middle of some fight that isn't my fight and get kicked around.
Can you argue that during this 10 years, say, that in fact much was normal about your life? And
much more than people think.
Yeah. Well, explain that to me.
Well, I think just to put it at its absolute simplest, 8.5 years ago I fell in love. You know, and I've been very, very happily living with the same woman. And we got married only 2 years ago, but we had a child 2 years ago.
You have a 2-year-old
son, yes. Right. And I also have a 20-year-old son, but
right.
So it's, you know, that's quite interesting, that. But, you know, so for a lot of the time when I was supposed to be miserable and unhappy and isolated and, you know, staring at the wall.
You were madly in love.
I was madly in love and incredibly happy. And that's one reason why I wanted to write a love story. Although there isn't exactly a me character, and there's certainly not a character based on my wife Elizabeth in here, but the kind of spirit of wanting to write a love story came from that, and not only from that personal love affair, but that I felt that one of the things that really sustained me in these 10 years was the incredible amount of affection and love I was shown, not only by my friends, but actually by total strangers, by people all around the world, you know, who just were very, very concerned that this thing should turn out right and that it shouldn't turn out wrong. And I now think of that as really the most important thing that ever happened, a very humbling thing, to be the recipient of so much of the world's just spontaneous sympathy and affection, you know. And more, that's what I remember from the dreadful period. You know, I remember not the hatred and the people shouting slogans and waving checks, you know.
And the anger you might have felt because your life had been so turned upside down and circumscribed.
Yes, all that. But much more than that, I remember the kind of affection and friendship and love that I was shown by many people. And there's no question that's how I got through it. Nobody gets through this alone.
I'd hate to make an awful analogy, but I have had people today say to me, who have a child with some kind of illness, and they'll say, you won't believe it, but in so many ways, this child, for all the pain and all the suffering, has taught me more about what love is about than I would ever have learned, and so in some ways it's a gift.
Yeah. Well,
I go that far, in a sense, and say it made me come to grips with things I might not ever have known.
Oh, yes, no question of it. I mean, I think I got an education in the extremes of human behavior and the extremes of human feeling. That's to say, you know, hatred as well as love. I saw them both in the most incredible, in the raw, you know, I mean, and magnified to an amazing intensity. And I mean, okay, the hatred's the hatred, and I learnt about that too, and the world is full of hatred, and no doubt that's useful for a writer to know about firsthand. But the thing that certainly changed me as a person, I think, really changed me, was the power, I mean, it seems corny, but, you know, the power of love.
And to sharpen your instincts to appreciate and understand those powerful emotions.
Yes, indeed. I think so.
Salman Rushdie, The Ground Beneath Her Feet, soon to be a song by Bono.
By you too, yes. Yeah. That's a kind of delight. Given that it's a novel that anyway, as we were saying earlier, kind of blurs the imaginative world and the real world a little bit, you know. Yeah. I thought it's rather lovely that this imaginary song should, you know, jump out of the book and become a CD, you know, over here. I mean, all that happened is that because of my long acquaintanceship and sort of friendship with them, I sent Bono and I sent the manager of the band, Paul McGuinness, copies of the manuscript when I wrote it. And partly because I wanted to do like a nervous check, you know, I wanted to make sure I hadn't said stupid things about contracts on the one hand.
Exactly. I got it right.
Yeah, exactly. And they read it and really liked it a lot. And then Bono was going into the studio with the band because they were starting work on their new album. And he said, you know, eventually he rang up and he said he'd written a melody to what he would call the title track.
Wow. Lyrics by, melody by.
Lyrics, exactly. Yeah. And as they were kind enough to point out to me, the writer owns half the song.
This is dedicated for Milan.
Yeah, that's my son, yes.
It's your son?
Yeah.
The 2-year-old?
The 2-year-old, yes.
And this quote from Rilke, in the sonnet to Orpheus, translated by M.D. Erda Norton. Set up no stone to his memory, just let the rose bloom each year for his sake. For it is Orpheus, his metamorphosis. Unto this and that we should not trouble about other names. Once and for all, it's Orpheus when they're singing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Back in a moment. Stay with us.
Thank you.
This is at least the third interview we've done. I don't remember, because I once came down to undisclosed location outside of Washington at the very beginning. We'll come to some life things first, but let's talk about this novel. I was surprised to find out how much you like music and how much music had meant to you as a young man in India.
Very much so, and I think it's
Pakistan.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was mostly India, actually. Right. I grew up in Bombay, and, well, Bombay is a big city, you know. It's a big, bustling, international kind of a city. Unlike many Indian cities, it has a lot of people from all over the world, you know. And I guess they brought their music with them, and that's one way in which I heard early rock and roll, you know, sitting in my friends' apartments listening to their records. The other way was, in those days, the Indian radio stations didn't play it. You know, it was thought to be not right. They should play Indian music.
Decadent.
Yeah, but what was then called Radio Ceylon, which would, I guess, be Sri Lanka, had a more tolerant policy, and they would have, at the weekends, they would play Western hit parades. You know, so the thing that amazes me looking back at it is how easily the music traveled. You know, is how there we were, these kids thousands of miles away, you know, from America, knowing nothing about America really except the movies and the comic books, and yet this music seemed to belong to us instantly, you know. And it strikes me now that maybe that was happening everywhere in the world. It's probably happening in, you know, Patagonia and Yokohama, that people were beginning to imitate Elvis's wiggle. You know,
I'm sure it is. That's true. I mean, I think it. And what conclusion do you arrive about that?
Well, just that it's very interesting that that was the first globalized cultural phenomenon at a time when the world had not been globalized, you know, when mass communications were still much more rudimentary than they now are. In India, we didn't even have a television service at that time. So the power of it is what that reveals, the depth of force with which it attacked young people. And
the fact that it is not language specific.
It's not language specific, although, you know, the words, I mean, you know, we liked the words, and you know, Elvis singing all shook up and kind of hiccuping at the right time.
But you could get it without knowing the lyrics.
You could get it without the words, yes. And maybe it just has to do with the beat and one's heartbeat. Maybe it just has to do with young people's needs to move their bodies in a certain way, you know.
And the expression of music at that time, at that place, around the world. For young people, all of a sudden matching a kind of exuberance and enthusiasm and desire to be free of everything that was old.
A kind of rebellious spirit, you know. My mum, of course, didn't like it, you know, but that, of course, was in common with kids with American mothers.
It made you love it even more.
Yeah, exactly. She wanted me to listen to Pat Boone.
Who did you listen to? The Beatles?
This was before the Beatles. This is the first generation. It was Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis and
Jimi Hendrix.
Well, even before that, the Drifters, you know. Then I came to England when I was 14, that's in 61. And immediately after that, they began this extraordinary flowering of the popular music scene in England, with the Beatles and the Stones and the Who and the Pink Floyd and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So it was just by good luck to arrive in England at the time that it got interesting in England.
This movie, this book, The Ground Beneath Her Feet, is about music in part, but it's more about fame.
Yes.
And what else? What are the grand themes here?
Well, I suppose fame, yes, or at least in the second half of the novel, when the two main characters, Ormus and Vina, become very famous rock stars, then of course it becomes a discussion of contemporary celebrity. I think, first and foremost, it's a love story. I mean, I really tried to write a knock 'em dead love story, but
it's a three-sided love story.
Well, yeah, as so many are.
Yeah.
And the third point of the triangle, the narrator, who is a photographer, Rai, and who kind of is also, as he puts it, Vina's backdoor man.
Yeah.
I think he spends the whole novel trying to get in through the front door, and waiting for his turn, and in ways I guess I shouldn't entirely reveal.
I'm trying to dance around that too.
By the end of the novel, it's his turn.
It's his, but he is the one who is in fact enjoys the sexual relationship.
Yes, he does. Yes, because it's one of these love affairs, Ormus and Vina's, which endlessly denies itself. They keep finding crazy reasons for not being together, and it's only relatively late in their lives that they actually are together and they're briefly happy, and then of course catastrophe.
Come back to that in a moment. Some have said, in fact I read a review today, that thought Rai was one of the best and most interesting characters you had ever conceived.
I must say, I thought that. I mean, one of the things that was most pleasurable writing the book was having him come alive on the page and begin to speak. I loved his voice, and I thought it allowed me to speak through him in new and fresh ways, And the only comparable feeling I can remember as a writer was like 20 years ago when I was writing Midnight's Children, and I found the narrative voice for the narrator of that novel, young boy Salim, who was born at the moment of the independence of India. And I've always thought, looking back, that when I found Salim's voice, I've always thought of that as the moment I became a writer, because I felt that for the first time I could start writing my sentences which weren't anyone else's. And I felt something the same with this. I felt kind of next phase, that this had opened some new doors in my writing.
When I hear people say, I found my voice, a character enabled me to find my voice, what does that mean?
Well, I think the whole trick, of the game, of being a writer, is to write your sentences which couldn't be anyone else's. It's very easy to write other people's sentences, especially when you're starting out.
Yeah.
And the struggle is you have to really know who you are, I think. That's the thing. And in writing, that can be a quite painful process of finding out. I mean, it took me a long time of floundering as a writer before I was clear where the center was and what I was trying to say and what was mine to say, rather than anyone's or someone else's.
So the first step in that process is find out who you are.
That's right. That's right. Well, it usually follows from that. I think once you know what is your story to tell, which could not be anyone else's story to tell, then you usually find the language to tell it.
How would you define what is your story to tell that is unique to you?
Well,
is it the colonial experience? Is it?
Well, in that beginning, it certainly was. I wanted to write about what it was like to grow up just after the end of the British Empire, and as part of the first generation of free Indians that there had been for 2 centuries and more. That's what I felt was my original story. There's another thing which is just an obvious fact in my story is that I moved around the world a lot, and so the subject also became a subject about migration, about movement, about dislocation. This book's very much about that. It's about uprooting, about the narrator keeps saying like a kind of mantra through the novel. He uses the phrase that disorientation is the loss of the East, and that's sort of what happened to me in a certain sense.
You chose to make this a kind of modern version of Orpheus. Mm-hmm. Is that an idea that sort of was bouncing around back in your head, and you all of a sudden now had the time or had the idea to? Yeah,
I had the idea years ago. I mean, in fact, I was looking through some old notebooks recently. I was looking through a notebook of mine from about '91. From when I was certainly busy writing. I was just beginning to think about the Moors Lasai, really, at that time. And I've got in this notebook in big capital letters the words Orpheus, rock and roll, yes, several exclamation marks underlined. And so that's obviously...
From that a novel is born.
Yeah, exactly. Well, more or less, yeah. I mean, because it's unusual for me, the speed with which I came up with this book after finishing the one before. Normally there's a kind of fallow period where things have to tank has to fill up again, you know, and you have to germinate stuff. But this time, I knew almost instantly when I finished The Moor's Last Sigh that it was time for Orpheus rock and roll, yes. You know,
but why rock and roll?
Well, just because I felt that it was kind of the soundtrack of my life, you know. I felt that it was the music that had come along the way with me, and that it was, in a way, my contemporary, that when I was young, the music was in its infancy, and now that I'm middle-aged, you know, my kids aren't listening to rock and roll music, you know, so because it's
they're listening to?
No, they're, you know, techno, jungle, trance, hip-hop, reggae,
right. Yeah, exactly.
you know what I mean? It's there's a new music now which is not what rock and roll used to be. It's something else. So that arc of the music as roughly speaking, you know, telling the story of the last 40 or 50 years, the music has got into all kinds of places during those years, you know. When I was protesting against the Vietnam War in England, you know, the music was protesting against the Vietnam War. So it allowed me quite naturally to reach into those kinds of areas through the music, on the wings of song.
You went with U2, with Bono and U2 and the gang, through several concerts.
Yeah, this was during their Zooropa tour in '93. What had happened is I'd got to meet them a couple of years before that. You know, they were interested in I mean, they wanted to be supportive, basically, you know, and I met them backstage after an earlier tour, the Achtung Baby tour, and we kind of got on, and then we got to know each other a bit, and then when they were embarked on the Zooropa tour and they came to Wembley Stadium in London, 85,000 capacity, they said, "How do you like to come out on stage with us?" And I said, well, there's no way I'm going to say no.
Yeah, of course.
So I had my 5 minutes of being...
And this was what year? This
93.
93.
93.
Yeah.
And so I had my 5 minutes of being... I didn't get to sing, I mean, which was just as well for the audience, I have to say. Nobody wants to... That's one thing I have really in common with the narrator of this novel, where he says he can't hold a note, you know. I mean,
that's true about you.
Yeah, when I was going to do this, and my teenage son was in the audience, and as I went up towards the stage, he said, "Dad, don't sing." And I just to wind him up.
As a reminder, Dad.
Exactly. Just to tease him, I said, well, you know, why not? I mean, I might sing. And he said, no, you see, if you sing, I'll have to kill myself.
or disown you.
Exactly.
You know, one or the other. Yeah. So I'll choose the honorable course and kill myself. About this a little bit. The notion is here that Lee Harvey Oswald's gun jammed. Watergate is a novel.
Yeah.
So Kennedy Lives. Watergate is a novel. What's at work in doing that? What might have been? Well,
I tell you where it started. It started in two places. One is that the basic premise of the novel, which is that these two people, Ormus and Vina, who become the biggest band in the history of rock and roll, come from Bombay. Right. You know, now, it struck me there's such a completely outrageously fictitious proposition. That in part it's comic, of course, you know, that I insist on it.
Yes.
And then I thought, well, if I'm doing that, if I'm sort of distorting the world in order to let them in, then let it not be the only such outrageously fictive proposition. Let's
have at everything.
Yeah, let's have at everything. That was one end of it. And the other end of it is it begins the novel with an earthquake in February 1989 in Mexico. An earthquake that never really happened, you know, and yet destroys a lot of the Pacific coast of Mexico. Yeah. And I got very agitated about whether it was okay to do that. You know, was it all right for me as a writer just to wave my wand and say goodbye Mexico? You know, and I thought, well, if I am doing it, what does it mean that I'm doing it?
Yeah.
And so then I found that what I was doing I said, okay, well, what I'm obviously doing is making a slightly variant form of the real world. And then I kind of just had fun with that idea.
Do you, this is way out of left field, as a result of what you have gone through, think about the responsibility of a writer differently?
Yes, in that I place a greater value on the art of literature even than I did before. And I mean, anybody who knows me knows that I've always been fairly vocational, you know, about writing. I now think even more highly of it. I think it's incumbent on the writer to exercise his freedoms, you know, as thoroughly as he knows how. And
not to be beaten over the head by the responsibility of the writer is to understand whatever sensitivities might be offended.
No, I'm sorry, that's complete nonsense. I mean, if we used the offense of sensibility as a criterion for what was in the bookstores, there'd be empty shelves. you know, because it's, I mean, the fact is that all kinds of people are sensitive about all kinds of things, and the fact about a book is that if you want to be not offended by it, you only have to shut it. You know, it immediately loses its power to offend you.
And
so,
without the capacity and the power to offend anything, then it loses some of its potency as literature.
Well, look, the thing is, I think about any art, you know, not just writing. I'm thinking about music, about painting, etc. All the artists I admire and know, what they want to do is push the envelope. Right. You don't want to sit in the middle of the safe ground.
But push the envelope in terms of what?
Well, just artistic risk. You know, you just go to the edge and try and increase the sum of what it's possible to think.
One more time, the book is called The Ground Beneath Her Feet. This is the conclusion of part 1 of our conversation with Salman Rushdie. Part 2 tomorrow night. See you then.